Our next presentation will be about tokenized securities, security tokens and asset-backed tokens, and we get a market overview by Dr. Johannes Schmitt. I've had the pleasure of meeting him. He's from Nyala. Do I pronounce that correct?
Nyala is correct.
Nyala, all right. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to your presentation, Johannes. Stage is yours.
Test, test, test. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Johannes Schmitt, and I'm a co-CEO of Nyala. In case you haven't heard that name yet, we just recently rebranded from Blockchain. So you may be familiar with our old brand. We rebranded 2 weeks ago. Nyala is an East African gazelle roaming in the savannas of Eastern Africa. It's elegant, it's agile, just like our solutions. We're a tech company. And it also has, of course, horns, thick horns, so it's a very bullish animal. And so what do we do at Nyala? We are a blockchain technology company, and focusing on particularly 2 areas of the entire crypto asset value chain. Those 2 areas are 1, custody, and 2, tokenization. I'm going to say a few words about each of these. For custody, we built a custody solution, and recently, we're the second provider in Germany to acquire a BaFin license for crypto custody, something we're very proud of. We recently, 2 weeks ago, sold this entity, this subsidiary of ours, to Hauck Aufhäuser Lampe Group, which is one of the very interesting M&A transaction, one of the first private banks to acquire a custodian in Germany. And we continue to provide the technology in terms of a SaaS agreement to the bank. So we will be involved in the future with the tech of this custodian. That's the first area. And the second one is tokenization. We have a state-of-the-art tokenization engine where we can tokenize all types of assets, which is the topic of this talk. And also recently, which also related to tokenized securities, have recently integrated a crypto registry service into our tokenization engine, which means we can also now help issue tokenized securities according to EWPG, the German digital securities law. So I'm going to talk a little bit, kind of slow, about the entire market, the security token market, which is very, very interesting. It has come up a few times on some of the panels at this conference already. The market size is fairly interesting. Then we're going to talk about the problems of adoption. And of course, very important for security tokens and tokenized securities, what's the impact of regulation? And then we'll take a short glimpse at the evolution of the capital markets and how tokenization kind of fits in there. And finally, a few predictions that I'm going to be making. Let's look at the market size. I mean, this is, many of you have probably heard or seen this before, but the problem with security tokens in general is that the market is just tiny, right? It's just tiny. The market cap of security tokens, meaning issuances on a blockchain or DLT layer, is just very, very small. We're here looking at data about the global market. In Germany, the market is, of course, way smaller. But even in on a global scale, it's just 4.1 billion, by the way. I think this is missing what this stands for, 4.1 billion, versus 2.1 trillion for the entire crypto assets market. This includes cryptocurrencies, coins, tokens, everything that is largely unregulated. So you have a huge difference between the crypto market on the whole and the security token market, and about 700x. And this is, even though we started talking about STOs, if you remember this, I've been in the industry for about 8-9 years, and I'm sure some of you as well have been here for a few years. We started talking about STOs in 2018. So it's now 2022, and we still haven't made a lot of headway in this sense. Don't worry, I won't be too pessimistic for the entirety of this talk. There's a few optimistic remarks at the end, but let's first look at the problems here, right? So if you look at this 4.1 billion, kind of zeroing in on the what currently exists out there, you'll notice that over half of it is just 2 or 3 tokens, right? So not only is this market very small, but it's also like very imbalanced between a few issuances that are fairly big and like many that are very, very small. So right now, Dignity Gold, which is a US-based asset-backed token, essentially it's a securitized gold, so portable gold on the blockchain essentially, is 25% of the entire market, right? So that's one. And the funny thing is, almost no one has heard of it in Germany if you ask people about Dignity Gold. And then the second one is still over the Overstock token, which is actually an equity token. So in the US, it's possible to tokenize, to issue tokenized securities also for equities. And this is Overstock. Some of you may remember Patrick Byrne. He's been an early pioneer of tokenization many years ago. And so that's still one of the biggest issuances to date. And then you have, of course, in Germany, I think Rado Albrecht was on the panel here. We have the BB1 token, which was the first bond in Germany on the blockchain in 2019. We also, by the way, our predecessor organization also issued a tokenized bond in 2019, Losteria token. Those are very small. So those are not even at like a few $1 million. Let's look at the reasons why is adoption so sluggish, right? Why does it take so many years for these tokens to gain traction? So actually, just looking at what has been, just the earlier panel discussions, a few points about this have been made, and I think one important point is that we now have in Germany, especially with EWPG, we have a way to legally issue securities on chain. Right? When we also have a way to custody those tokens, but that's it, right? We don't have. There's a lot of different other work streams that haven't been integrated with the issuance process. Right? There's a lot of different. When you issue traditional securities, there's a lot of different players, a lot of information, a lot of endpoints that are being shared, a lot of data that is essentially aggregated, and that data right now can't be aggregated on chain. So as someone who has some experience with issuing these security tokens, we know this. I think one good example is settlement, right? So delivery versus payment. It's not like there's any kind of way to, there's no electronic, or sorry, no blockchain or on-chain cash token, right? There's no digital euro on chain where you can say, well, I issue a token and you send me some, delivery versus payment, you send me some digital euros in return. That is not possible. There's many reasons for that. There's no widely accepted stablecoin issued by a big bank. There's also no, as we all know, there's no CBDC in the euro zone yet. There's talks about it. If this finally happens in a few years, it will very likely not be a DLT-based digital euro, right? So there's many shortcomings, and we think that those are limiting and hampering the process of tokenizing assets. It's not I think a lot of people would agree with me, these are just impediments to tokenization. If the whole entire process is fragmented, it doesn't make sense in terms of gaining efficiency to use tokenization to put security tokens on the blockchain. Right? And then finally, also worth mentioning, there's also the barrier to entry. It's very easy for exchanges to list crypto assets, right? So essentially FTX or my former employer, Kraken, can list an interesting crypto asset within probably 48 hours or less now. There's a lot of professionalization in this space in terms of quick listings, but they will never list a security token in that amount of time because you need to get regulatory approval to do that. And even if you look at the European issuances so far, very few of them are actually tradable on a regulated exchange. In fact, there aren't really any big regulated exchanges that allow access to secondary markets for tokenized assets. So those are the barriers. Let's also look at the regulation. As I promised, the regulation is positive, certainly something positive. In Germany in 2021, June of 2021, we have the Bundestag approved the EWPG. So now it is possible in Germany to do this legally, to issue security on a blockchain. And we do think there will be more traction that this entire technology will gain over time. Right now, it's not that much. There's there's about, if you check the BaFin website that lists all the issuances according to EWPG, there's about six to date that have been done. Most of these are proof of concepts. So there's a few institutions playing around with the idea, like getting used to the technology, learning about it, which is totally fine. But it's not like there's this widespread adoption of this law yet. And also, as also some of the other speakers mentioned, there's this regulated financial service that is the crypto registrar service or crypto registry service, Krypto-Registerführung in German. And as I said, Nyala is also applying for that license. We have the preliminary license to be a Krypto-Registerführer, and just like others, we are applying for the full license, which is, I think, applications are due in June. So there's also still a lot of groundwork that is being done by not just institutions, but also smaller fintechs to be able to offer the service to also bigger institutions, right? But in general, so if summarizing, I think this is a very positive development in the German market. The German market, of course, on a global scale is not that impactful. If we look at the European level, that's, of course, you have suddenly 27 markets that are subject to that. And you have, of course, the DLT pilot regime that has also come up a few times already at this conference. And that is, again, this is positive, but as anything on the European level, it's very slow. It's very hard to say when exactly is this going to start. Same with MiCA, right? We've been waiting for MiCA for a few years. So there's a lot of this uncertainty and waiting for something to take shape at the European level. And then for the pilot regime is certainly good for bigger institutions that already have an MTF and want to play around with this new technology. But for smaller players like us, it's not that significant, at least as far as we know. And I also personally don't think it's going to have a huge impact on the market. So regulation is largely positive. Adoption is at very, very sluggish. Maybe, and yet I'm optimistic about the future of this technology. So how come? So I want to just maybe take a step back and look at the greater history of capital markets and how tokenization fits in there. And I think and if we do that, if we kind of step back and look at what happened in the last 30 years, I think it's easier to appreciate that tokenization can make a meaningful contribution to the evolution of markets in terms of additional liquidity, increasing market participation, increasing democratization, hard word, and access to markets. So if we look at just the 1990s, when the beginning of the internet age, dematerialized trading became standard. It was no longer a thing you didn't need the physical certificate to engage in securities trading. Securities trading happened largely in electronic ledgers. So that was already a huge step forward in terms of making markets more efficient, making trading more efficient, and increasing participation. That then led, together with some legislation in the US as the reference market for securities trading, led to some electronic trading, the advent of electronic trading. So the idea of someone logging into, via their internet access, logging into a portal and trading securities at home was, of course, something that no one would have foreseen in the 1980s, but that happened around the turn of the century. One thing that helped with that was certainly the decimalization of trading. So you didn't really have to trade fractions of securities anymore, like before, but now you could trade decimals. And so you could have much smaller increments in pricing. And also that led to tighter spreads and to generally more volume and more liquidity in the markets. And you can actually trace this. There has been, all these technological advances have had an impact on the overall liquidity of the markets. And Fireblocks actually put out in a very interesting reports recently, shout out to them on how these technological advances affected or positively impacted liquidity and participation in the markets. And then you have, of course, securitization in the 2000s and 2010s. We know about the financial crisis. You can say that part of that has to do with securitization of a certain type of asset, namely mortgages, right? So you have subprime mortgages that are being securitized. The idea of securitizing all types of assets is certainly also was fairly novel. And that, even though we had the financial crisis, which has many factors, thank you, that didn't in itself, that didn't stop securitization. Securitization is ongoing, and now you just marry securitization with tokenization, and you have a very, very powerful tool to further increase liquidity of the markets and access to the markets of new participants. So just a few examples. When you have tokenization and securitization, you can not only tokenize real assets real assets like real estate, fine art, or vintage cars, for example. You can also tokenize assets like digital assets, like hash rate. So some of you maybe have heard of the Blockchain mining node, which is essentially now a security in, I believe, Luxembourg with an ISIN. That is essentially a securitized hash rate. So it's a token that can be traded, it's a security, but it is tied to the current hash rate of the Bitcoin protocol. So that's an entirely new type of security where something is being securitized that isn't a physical good, but a digital good. And it is a traditional security in the sense of having an ISIN, and will hopefully eventually be traded on secondary markets that are specialized in tokenized assets, right? So that's something new. In the future, there might be cases where NFTs or baskets of NFTs are being tokenized and B, also securitized, right? There's no reason why there shouldn't be a security, again, with an ISIN that tracks a certain basket of NFTs, or there's tokenized funds is also something that is happening in Germany with Fondsanteilsverordnung, so that fund shares can be traded and tokenized, and there's no reason why all these digital assets shouldn't also be securitized. So I think there's a lot of interesting innovation being made possible by the combination of securitization and tokenization. And this is, so tokenization is just one stop in this history of capital markets becoming more efficient, and the audience and the group of participants being increasing over time. And I think it's inevitable that this happens, and it's happening already. It just may take some time, just like some of these other things that we looked at took sometimes 10, 20 years. So this is my optimistic outlook. I think this entire economy will take off. I can't say that it's for sure it's going to be next year. It might be 2 years or 3 years. We're in this market. We believe in this market. This is why we're committed to it, and we acquiring these licenses for a reason. And maybe it sometimes helps to look back at what happened 5 years ago. We had the ICO bubble. A lot of people thought this was crazy, right? There were a lot of scammers, a lot of fraud. People just overnight created tokens and tried to tokenize their own company somehow. And this was complete chaos. It was, a state where anything seemed to be possible, and then the regulators started to crack down on these projects. And we've learned, since then, we've learned a lot. There's been a lot of interesting business models that are regulated. Since then, there's been the EWPG that I mentioned. There's been other interesting products like the Blockchain mining node that I just referenced. So there's a lot of positive learnings from this. And there needs to be exuberance at some point when a new technology arrives. You could talk about how tulip mania in the 15th century or the 16th century, that was a symptom of capital markets maturing in Europe, in Western Europe at the time, right? In the same sense, you could say that the ICO bubble is a symptom of a new technology, namely tokenization, maturing in the world. And so I believe that this technology is here to stay, and we're just at the very, very beginning of this long process. Thank you for your attention.